I had left high school. I went to an all-girl Catholic high school in Toronto, and I had left high school with the dream of becoming a nurse. And I put that dream on hold and started working for a large telecommunication company. And I met my husband during this time, and not recognizing that he was abusive. I married him. My parents were against the relationship, but I went ahead and did it anyway. And as abuse is, it escalated once everything got behind closed doors. And I walked away from that marriage with very low self-esteem, low opinion of myself. I also conceived a little boy in the marriage, and during the abuse had turned on my son. And so that was the greatest reason I left. I would sustain the abuse. I would take the hits, if you will. But when the abuse turned on my small child, then I knew it was time to go. I needed to get out. And I was very ashamed to ask my parents for help because they did not want me to get into this situation in the first place. But I asked for the help. So I came away from this very damaged. Part of my story around the abuse is rape. I was raped during the marriage. I did not conceive in the rape, but my son, we reconciled. I had left him and gone back. My son was conceived later. So my son was born, looking like my husband, reminding me of my husband, but just the center of my world. And I never at any time had any desire to give my child away because he reminded me of the abuse of my husband. And he was my salvation and my hope, and he was the reason I was able to leave the abuse. So when I came out of this, a very damaged woman, I had, as I mentioned, very low self-esteem, a really low opinion of myself. I started acting out inappropriately. I was living with my parents at this point, and my son was being well cared for by them. When I would go to work, they would take him away to the cottage on weekends and so on. And so I had this alter life that my son was protected from and wasn't aware of. And it was during this acting out phase, just needing to be loved, that I became pregnant by somebody that I didn't know all that well. And I remembered when I was in high school, right across sort of kitty corner from St. Joseph's Wellesley in Toronto, there was access to birth control and certainly access to abortion, even though it was illegal at the time. We knew that girls were having abortions. I didn't know where they were going for them. And so when I became pregnant, I felt like I had no other choice. And I remembered this place. It was called the Bay Center for Birth Control at the time. And I've since learned that it was under the heading of Planned Parenthood. And so that's where I sought to be counseled. And I was really looking for another answer in my soul, in my heart, because I'd already had a child. I knew when I conceived that this was a life within me, and I was filled with joy initially. And then all of the weight of the world came on my shoulders. What am I going to name this child? What am I going to tell my son? What am I going to tell my parents, who I so desperately needed approval from? And how am I financially going to manage this child? I was still, thinking about possibly going into nursing. And so I felt that, abortion, I had heard, was legal. Although it wasn't in 1986, it was not completely legal except in the case of the health of the mother. And I went for the counseling, and I have to say that they were very kind to me. They didn't tell me the whole truth, but there was this sense, this aura of secrecy, and it seemed like all the lights in the room, in my memory now, they seemed to be very dimmed and low, and there was a lot of hushing, and they came in and spoke to me, and then they left again, and then they came back. I believe that I was supposed to have sat before a panel of doctors, and I never saw a doctor. And so they arranged for me to meet with the abortionist, who worked out of her office further down Bay Street, and would perform the abortion at Women's College Hospital. And so I went to the meeting with her, and that meeting I remember being very cold, and not giving me any idea of any chance of how I could possibly save this child, because if somebody had given me that crumb, then I probably would have said yes to keeping my baby. So I visited with the doctor, with the abortionist, and I told her that I had booked a trip to Florida with my young son before I was aware that I was pregnant, and could I possibly have the procedure done when I got back from Florida. I was still very unsure, and she said no. Time was marching on. I needed to have this done as quickly as possible. She examined me, and I said to her, "What does my baby look like?" And she said, "Your baby's just a blob of tissue and a mass of cells." She actually didn't say your baby, pardon me. She said it is just a blob of tissue and a mass of cells. And I had a child, and that just didn't make sense to me. However, it was a comfort knowing that, well, it's just tissue I'm getting rid of. It's not an actual human being, in my opinion. And so she had told me that I was 8 weeks pregnant. And I've learned since, because she inserted laminaria that day. Laminaria is seaweed, of course, to stretch the cervix. And I've been told by other obstetricians and gynecologists that they probably wouldn't have used that procedure at 8 weeks, especially back in 1986. And I remember her telling me that she was inserting 4 to 5 sticks of the laminaria. And so when I've explained this since, my understanding is that my child was further advanced, further along than the 8 weeks. That was very hard to take. And now, like in my recovery, it hurt. It was extremely painful. I wasn't given any kind of an injection. And then I was told to go home and go and wait overnight, which is unusual for, an 8-week-old child. And I went home, and I had this sense of just being nothing, of being nobody. And she said to me, "Once this is done, there's no turning back. You can't undo this now." And so I thought, okay, it's done. And the next day, my mother actually drove me to work. I normally worked in the evening, so I could be home with my son during the day. And they watched me in the evening, and she offered to drive me to work this morning. And she never did that. And I really believe that was the hand of God reaching out, trying to help me, and I ignored it. I remember going into my place of work and hiding, which interestingly was in the Young Eglinton area, waiting for her to leave. My son was in the car, and waiting for her to leave so that I could then go to the subway. I have no recollection of the hospital itself. I do remember sitting on the subway thinking, if the people on the subway knew what I was about to do, they would hate me. And then I remember being in the surgical room, and it was very cold, the coldest room I've ever been in my life. And it was a cold, not like it's cold out today. It was an internal cold that you can't describe. And I asked her one more time before they put me right out, "What does my baby look like?" And she said, "Stop calling it a baby. It's just a blob of tissue." And so that was it. They knocked me out. And when I came to, I started to scream, "I want my baby. What did you do with my baby?" And there was a male nurse in the room, and he was tending to me on the stretcher. And he leaned over the stretcher, and he said to me, "Shut up. You're upsetting other people in the recovery room." And he condemned me to a silence of almost 19 years because I was so ashamed, and I was so filled with guilt and remorse at what I had just done. They gave me juice and cookies and then sent me home. I remember when I went home, a family member was there, and I came in. My mother, of course, had no idea what was going on. I had to be picked up from the hospital by a cousin, picked me up and took me home. But another family member was waiting for me at home who knew, and she looked at me and she said to me, "You smell like a hospital, you better go have a shower." And so I never spoke about it again. I went to Florida, and actually in Florida, I almost killed my son down there through drinking and, not being responsible. I became a full-blown alcoholic. I may have been predisposed for alcoholism, but I believe that the abortion itself was the edge of the cliff, and the only thing that could quiet the voices in my heart, could take away the nightmares, was the alcohol, and then the alcohol just took care of me. It was a while later, in the middle of my disease, where I realized I needed help, and not recognizing that the abortion was in any way connected to the disease of alcoholism. And so I reached out to a 12-step group and got myself a really good sponsor. And it was my sponsor that I finally confided in that I had had this abortion. And she was Catholic, and she said to me, "The best thing that you could do for yourself is join this thing called the Life Chain and stand out and just hold up a sign." And it was one of the hardest things I ever did in my life, because I felt by holding that sign, everybody was looking at me saying, "You had an abortion." But I had to do it, and it was the first step. And thank God she asked me to do that. And I made my way back and came back to the Catholic Church, back to the God of my understanding, and came to understand that there is forgiveness and there is healing. I believe I conceived a little girl. I've named her Noelle Marie. And I know that we will meet again one day, and I know that she's proud of her mommy. I had to tell my boys, my oldest son, because I did become pregnant again. I just wanted so badly to make up for what I had done, and I did have a second child. And he I overprotected him. He was just everything to me. But when I told him when he was 16 years old that I had had an abortion, the first words out of his mouth were, "Mommy, I always knew I had a sister." And that affirmed for me that I had conceived a little girl. My oldest son forgave me for, the abortion. When I told him, I needed their blessing to be able to go forward to share my testimony. And he forgave me. And he said, "Mom, I love you, but I forgive you. You need to do this. You need to tell the truth." And so it's been a terrific journey home. Going to confession with the church was one of the greatest things that ever happened to me. I thought I'd be excommunicated. And I remember the first time I went, because I went many, many times, I couldn't forgive myself. And I said to my beautiful priest, "Forgive me, Father, for I've sinned. I had an abortion." And he looked at me and he said, "Debbie, welcome home." And I've never felt more loved and more supported in all my life. So the journey goes on. I miss her with all my heart. I take full responsibility for the choice that I made. But I didn't have all the facts, and I will regret it for the rest of my life. There's nothing that I can do to turn back the hands of time. She's a part of my soul. She's a part of every fiber of my being. And that's my testimony.